Welcome back to Seeking the Truth about the Sword of Truth. My name is Tom, and I'll be your guide as we spend this episode exploring Chapter 3 of Wizard's First Rule. In our last episode, we experienced the introduction of Kaylin and observed the techniques Goodkind used to create quick bonds between her and the reader long before we ever learned her name. Please note that these chapters contain spoilers, heavy spoilers, not just for this chapter, but for future chapters and books in the series. If you haven't read the series yet and you intend to, I'd encourage you to read the books first and then come back and see what I think about them. Spoiler alert, I think you'll enjoy them. We begin the chapter with Richard approaching his brother Michael's house. The second piece of information we're given about Michael is, in addition to being an influential politician, he is also very well off. Between the Senate and the House of Representatives in the United States, there are roughly 530 elected officials. 207 of them are listed as having a net worth greater than $1 million, fairly evenly split with 114 Republican representative millionaires and 93 Democrat representative millionaires. The link between wealth and political leadership is a long-established relationship in politics, with the percentage of millionaires being more than 10 times the national average of millionaires living in the United States. Each representative's story is different, and sometimes it can be difficult to figure out if it was wealth that allowed them to pursue politics, or politics that allowed them to pursue wealth. But the data shows an even split between both parties regarding politics as a place where one would expect to find wealthy people. It should also be noted that 121 of those officials were reported as having a negative net worth, many of those being in the red for millions of dollars. The split reflects the same percentage of wealthy politicians when divided by political party, with 59 Democrat representatives and 62 Republicans being reported as having a negative net worth. By the end of the first full paragraph, Richard notices the flowers in full bloom. The sentence focuses on the greenhouses required to do this, but the actual intent of the sentence is to subtly establish the time of year for the reader as late in the year. This establishes a timeline for later on in the novels as the first day of winter becomes very important to Dark and Rawl and the people trying to stop him. As Richard and Kaylin arrive at the party and find themselves mingling with other, much better dressed individuals, Richard catalogs another fact about Kaylin when he notes how comfortable she is among the upper echelons of society. We learn on their journey to Michael's event that Richard enjoys a simple life, living in the woods and selling his services to travelers as a guide. This is a sharp contrast against the life of his brother Michael. We're never given a detailed look into Richard's finances until he starts his own business of selling charcoal and iron in Faith of the Fallen. Given the information provided, it's reasonable to assume that he leads a simple life, where his modest income is supplemented with skills that can produce or create the necessities of life that could also be paid for with money. Those skills are repeatedly referenced throughout every book in the series, and oftentimes Richard's ability to produce for himself, rather than rely on another to produce for him, is the difference between success and failure. Kaylin asks Richard if he has a fireplace and if he's allowed to use it. But when she is asked why she was curious, she offers another deflection, which Richard recognizes in the next sentence as somehow part of a secret she is keeping for herself. We then experience a break in tone that transitions from the brooding and contemplative words like grief, secrets, dark mood, and upset, scattered throughout the beginning of the chapter, into more relaxing verbiage like warm greeting, clasped hands, lifting an eyebrow, and the grin on Chase's face. The change centers around Chase's introduction and subtly and subliminally makes the association between Chase and things getting better when he is around. If you look to the character of Chase throughout the entire series, he is almost universally portrayed as a character who improves morale. The author spends an entire paragraph describing Chase as a very skilled, dangerous, and well-prepared individual, and tells the readers what they can expect from him as a character. He is perceptive, strong, suspicious, and deadly. This is in stark contrast to many of the descriptions we get about Richard. The author leaves it to the reader to make up their own connections about his character traits through their reactions to him rather than an exposition about them, including the next thing Richard says to Chase when he introduces him to Kaylin. He says that Chase can trust her, and in the following sentence says that Richard Word was all the reassurance he needed to settle the matter. To reinforce the significance of that level of trust, the next sentence demonstrates Chase's suspicious nature by having him break from the conversation to scan the crowd for any trouble that may have developed in the last 30 seconds. The boundary wardens under Chase, which he refers to as his boys, are described as masters of camouflage and blending in, and Chase is only on display because he was told to stay visible. We also learn that Michael caused a bit of a political stir by bringing the boundary wardens to act as his personal guards. The next paragraph is very efficient in terms of creating an emotional and psychological bond with this new character through the use of a story circle combined with a modified version of the 5 stages of grief. Chase, the protagonist, recognizes some strange things going on regarding the murder of George Cypher. Chase leaves his comfort zone to go and investigate. The unfamiliar situation he needs to adapt to is that his normal methods of acquiring information aren't giving him the results he wants. He adapts to this by using his most trusted techniques to try and shake something loose. Chase gets what he wants when he concludes that there was no information to be gathered. Chase pays a price when he has to admit that he wasn't able to get even a whiff despite his best efforts, returning to his original comfort zone equally, if not more suspicious, that something was going on than he was before he started looking. Chase is portrayed universally as an exceptionally confident character. This is shown when he skips the first stage of denial entirely and goes straight to the second stage of anger when he discusses the loss of his friend George Cypher. Bargaining at stage 3 is covered when he talks about the different methods he used to try and get the information and how he knows it would work if only he could find the right person to ask. Stage 4 of depression is when he admits that this is the first time he's gone looking for something and wasn't able to generate a lead. A statement which also has the dual purpose of reinforcing the competence of Chase as a tracker. Stage 5 is acceptance, and that is shown when his grin comes back and he changes the subject to Richard's appearance. The author uses this exchange to further flesh out the character of Chase as someone who is of high authority regarding matters of law enforcement and investigation. Chase receives the information as a matter of fact and promises to check it out. When he presses Richard for an explanation, Richard repeats the explanation Kaylin gave him. Chase displays a strong sense of loyalty to Richard when he says it's best to keep this bit of information from Michael. This decision is actually more meaningful to those of us who are reading the books beyond the first time. We later learn that Michael is working with Dark and Rawl, and that Dark and Rawl is searching for Kaylin. It's very plausible that news of 4 men being killed by his brother, along with a mysterious woman, would have been everything Michael needed to immediately give Dark and Rawl everything he needed to find them. Depending on Michael's level of deductive reasoning, it could be more of a motivating factor with his invitation to have Kaylin spend the evening with him instead of leaving the party. In the world of what-if speculation, a good starting point to that alternative plotline could be what if Michael had learned about the death of the Quad at his party instead of later on. Chase offers to take Richard and Kaylin in to keep them safe. Richard dismisses the idea for fear of putting his friend's children at risk, and Chase informs Richard that Zed has been looking for him. We are reminded of the mysterious snake-like cloud and left to wonder what that's all about. The author crams a lot of information into the next paragraph, accomplishing different things at the same time. We're given another comparison of Richard's character versus that of his brother. He prefers a home that surrounds him with nature, and Michael prefers to be surrounded by physical representations of his elevated status over the men who have the skill to create those things. So we're given a taste of tragic nostalgia, where Richard is given happiness by remembering how close he and his brother used to be. But instead of enduring, that happiness actually behaves like a slow-acting poison, because the fixed future events tell a story of loss without redemption. Psychologically, this creates a bond with Richard as we see a very relatable kind of self-inflicted suffering that is caused by reliving the past mistakes, and only focusing on what was lost and how things could have been better if only some magically perfect arrangement of words had been used at some point to change the outcome. Finally, it offhandedly mentions Richard's mother and only associates her with the positive parts of his childhood memories. Cementing this moment in a positive tone makes the story Michael tells later about their mother's passing hit from a positive place instead of a neutral one. In the next few sentences, the author gives us a unique point of view by telling the story from the perspective of Richard's train of thought. Early in the novel, we're given examples of Richard processing information. It starts with observation. He notices how comfortable Kaylin seems to be among all of these people, and again notes that she must be someone who's very important. Then he remembers she is important because assassins hunt important people. The assassins came through the boundary to track her. Her coming through the boundary, bringing danger through the boundary after her, makes him reevaluate the stories people have told him about things coming out from the boundary and leaving people dead and torn apart. This builds into Richard's character that he is not entrenched in holding on to what he thinks he knows and is willing to change his thinking if the situation presents himself with new information. Richard has a moment of methaseophobia, a fear of change, which can be triggered by intense emotional distress or also caused by a large amount of changes in a very short amount of time to a person's life. He pushes through that, and his train of thought connects Zed to the Midlands, and the train stops there because Richard has run out of new information to connect. All he has is a suspicion that his father's death is somehow all connected to the Midlands. The train of thought trails out with an echo as the word father is repeated over and over again in his mind, and then again once by Kaylin when she breaks his concentration. Kaylin displays sympathy to Richard, and the two of them approach a large variety of food that is being served. Kaylin remarks that only women of high status are allowed to have long hair in the Midlands, and confirms what Richard always suspected about her having a high social standing. The author then cements a running theme that continues throughout the rest of the novels when he describes a specific facial expression from Kaylin as the smile of sharing. Finally, Kaylin has doubts about the food and turns to Richard for information before she eats any. This is a clear reference to the cannibalistic tendencies of the Mud People and possibly other groups of people in the Midlands. This interaction is the first half of a comparison that the author creates when later in the book, instead of behaving as Richard did when Kaylin trusted him to give her food that was untainted, she did not reciprocate that trust and instead misled him about what he was eating. This is a similar dynamic to the one created by mentioning Richard's mother in a fond setting before Michael then ties her to a tragic story. The sense of loss is made deeper by comparison. Setting up this interaction as a baseline reinforces her betrayal of omission in later chapters. At the same time, the author establishes an important bit of foreshadowing regarding Richard and Kaylin's feelings about cheese. Kaylin initiates a story circle by asking Richard to get her a piece of cheese. She is the protagonist, and she has a need to confirm her suspicion that someone might be watching them. She's already out of her comfort zone and can't act freely, so she adapts to the situation by asking Richard to get her a piece of cheese. She gets what she wanted when Richard brings back the cheese, and she finds out the men who were watching them are specifically paying attention to Richard. She pays a price for this when Richard gets annoyed and dismisses her concerns. Now she's back where she started, having changed by becoming even more worried about her safety and his as well. Kaylin foreshadows that more quads will be sent to follow her. The speculation in the last chapter about Richard underestimating the tracking abilities of these men sent after Kaylin is reinforced here when he claims that tracking her to Heartland would be impossible, citing his own expertise as the only evidence he needs to back up such a claim. Kaylin gets angry and reveals that 5 wizards used magic to cover her tracks and then killed themselves, so it would be impossible for them to give up information that might betray her. Richard gathers this fact and mentally notes that wizards exist in the Midlands. We also learn that the men hunting her were interested in more than just killing her. The author takes a moment and inserts Richard as a proxy for the readers. He takes a moment to try and recenter Kaylin by confiding in her that he is just as scared and knows even less than she does, which encourages the reader to bond with Richard as a sympathetic advocate. It's impossible for the reader to fully sympathize with Kaylin at this point because we know so little about her. We only know as much about her as Richard does, and he validates that frustration. It also mimics the same dynamic that Chase introduced earlier when he said Richard's word was good enough for him. Those words are meant to sway the reader to accept Richard as a narrative authority. In this instance, Richard's words are meant to be good enough for us to extend our sympathy for her on his behalf. All of the bonding exercises that Terry has been using for Richard are meant to pay off here, when that credibility is leveraged to encourage sympathy for Kaylin on his behalf. Richard immediately transitions into a plan of action to take her to see Zed after they stop at his house to spend the night. Richard comforts her by mentioning a fire, and for the 3rd time in this chapter sets up a positive association, so that later it can add to the impact of a negative association made by Michael during his speech. Richard extends some of his credibility to prop up Chase's reputation to Kaylin and the reader when he says that a quad wouldn't even be a problem for him, and further humanizes him as having a soft and compassionate side when he tells her that he's been watching out for her ever since they got here. Kaylin mentions traveling through the boundary and says she doesn't know how the men followed her, or even how they knew she had been through the boundary at all. The route and method that the first quad used to track her through the boundary is never confirmed. We learn later on that Darkenrall has the magic to send people through, the same as Kaylin was sent through by other wizards, but we also learn of the existence of a pass through the boundary. Given the information we have access to, the most plausible explanation of how the quad got through the boundary was that Darkenrall was alerted to her presence when she traveled through it, and assisted his men in crossing the boundary directly without the need for a pass. This explanation covers how they knew she was in Westland, how they knew where to start looking, and how they were able to catch up with her so quickly when she left the boundary. Finally, in Chapter 14, Richard and Zed speculate that the past they discover is unlikely to be known to Rawl because of his ability to cross it easily. And finally, is reinforced by the fact that while a surviving member of the second quad did track them into the pass, there were no enemies waiting for them when they entered and traveled through the pass and got out the other side. The author gives us a quick reinforcement of Richard's problem-solving tendencies as he mentally commits to finding an answer to her problem, as well as figure out what's going on with the boundary. When Michael appears to give his speech, the author makes a very clear statement that Michael is not the Rand Richard is, calling him heavy and soft. Richard waves, Michael notices, and smiles at him. There is an argument to be made that during the time Richard was gone searching for clues, Dark and Rawl had made contact with Michael. By the end of the book, we learn that to have been true, but are never given an exact timeline. We learn later on that Dark and Rawl is currently waiting at Richard's house at this very moment. If you were making that argument, then in addition to mentioning Michael's men watching every move Richard made, you would need to point out that there is an added significance to Michael making eye contact with Richard, smiling, and then holding that eye contact for a moment longer. The simplest explanation of how Rawl knows where Richard lives, how close his house is to his brother's house, when Richard is going to be returning due to his attendance at a scheduled event for his brother, could all be things that Michael told him. The two biggest objections that would get in the way of that theory would be answering the questions of why didn't Rawl just come to the event instead, and why didn't he go immediately to Zed's house after not finding Richard in his own house, because surely Michael also knew where Zed lived. Since all of this happens out of the view of the reader, it's impossible to know what sort of blended interactions happened here, and which characters had what information at any given time, because it's never explained, is not observable, and contains many different equally probable explanations of the same event. We're presented with something I like to call Schrodinger's backstory, named after the Schrodinger's cat thought experiment by Austrian-Irish physicist Erwin Schrödinger. Without becoming overly dry and scientific, the simplest explanation of the experiment is that quantum mechanics behaves differently under observation. Having to pick your nose is a good example of this. Being observed can influence your behavior. In quantum mechanics, when equally probable events exist at the same time, they're present in a state called quantum superposition. Meaning, while unobserved, all of the possible and equally likely explanations exist as true events simultaneously. To apply that to this analogy, all of those explanations are equally valid until we begin to observe them. When Schrödinger's box is opened, the event is observed and the probability wave collapses to a single state. That is, a single measurable event. The insinuation being that when we think of what might have happened, we create a single version of an event that is just as possible as a different single version of that same event. When we stop thinking about what happened and are no longer observing the event, our interpolation of those events fades back into the probability wave and no longer exists as a fixed point. So my best answer to the question of when Michael and Dark and Rawl got together, what information they shared and when, is that the answer exists in a state of literary superposition, where an infinite number of equally plausible explanations occasionally converge to produce one of an infinite number of separate, but also equally plausible and independently valid explanations. During Michael's speech, the author introduces what will become a long-standing tendency to display corrupt men and women in authority as publicly charismatic and privately reprehensible. We're also given a display of public persuasion where the average person is not capable of knowing when their leaders are telling them things that aren't true. Goodkind often uses the trusting and faithful citizen archetype as a symbol for the consequences of abandoning the ability to think critically. In most situations when he displays this, the citizen elevates their leader to a position of infallibility. Reason becomes replaced with faith, and a logical attack from an outside force is no longer met with a logical reaction. It is instead met with faith that dismisses any alternative message as outright blasphemy. A modern-day example of this would be our tendency as a species to gravitate towards one side or the other of a divisive issue. Goodkind uses Richard as an example of how a good citizen questions and can find value in all sides of an argument, where the faithful citizen has lost his agency and is no longer capable of seeing evil on their own side, nor the good within the opposing side. Goodkind reduces the faithful citizen to nothing more than inconsequential background noise, and many of their interactions exist only to show the effects of those actions being the direct result of the people in charge telling them that they need to act that certain way. Michael does this frequently when Goodkind describes the crowd's reaction following a set and predetermined course by Michael. Their faith in his words makes the speech a formality, since Michael can reliably make them think and feel as he sees fit. During his speech, Michael creates what is known as a false flag narrative. A false flag narrative is a story created to establish an enemy that becomes an immediate threat to the common man. This sort of technique is a weaponization of the story circle. The ability to recognize story structure is a passive ability that for many of us we do not realize is happening at all times around us. Michael establishes to the crowd that they are the very important protagonist and gives them a call to adventure to protect themselves against a looming threat, the threat of change. Michael spends time describing how strange and different the new land of the Midlands is and what a foreign and unfamiliar place it would be. He then gives the people a vehicle to adapt to that threat, and this is where the weaponization of the story circle occurs. Michael ties the adaptation necessary to overcome the threat to a specific call to action set by him that will guarantee that success. And by comparison, a failure to agree means losing everything. In this case, claiming that not only are their lives at stake, but the lives of their children and grandchildren as well. To complement his weaponized story circle, Michael also engages in emotional gaslighting. He creates a closed, hypothetical situation with facts that are above suspicion of any sensible and rational man, and offers only one viable solution to avoid the intolerable stigma of being a bad person by not agreeing with him. We see that approach to persuasion and exchange of information built into almost every divisive topic imaginable. A headline or article makes a claim designed to incite anger or trigger a fear of loss. A picture is painted of how awful the opponent's position is. A call to action is made when a specific course of action is directed or implied, and then both positive and negative reinforcement are used to either reward or punish those depending on whether they agree or disagree with the call to action being made. That makes the act of questioning or analyzing the original claim or the necessity and merits of said call to action equivalent to moral insolvency. For people reading the novel for a second or third time, notice how Michael reveals several bits of accurate information and already starts planting seeds for agendas that come directly from Dark and Raw. The boundaries are coming down. Meet our brothers with open arms. Don't fight them. Fire is dangerous. We need to do something about it. Richard is a symbol for the rational citizen and meets every claim with a comparison to independently known facts. And even though the words come from his own brother, he treats them with skepticism when his own knowledge and experience is contradicted by Michael's claims. The crowd acts as a faithful citizen should and makes no such demands of the powerful man in charge of them. The author also shows that this type of action is not built into us naturally, and shows the struggle that Richard has to overcome when he feels the psychological effects of that manipulation trying to overwhelm his logic and reason. It also shows the quick different mental paths that Richard takes to find any logistical justification he can that would validate the feelings he's having. The difference between Richard and the faithful citizen is not the lack of emotional connection that is created by the emotional gaslighting. Richard is every part their equal in that. He is only separated by them when he chooses to put his feeling aside and questions what's being presented to him as a fact. Terry takes a moment to wink at the reader when he interrupts Michael's emotional and moving retelling of his mother's death by mentioning the readiness of Michael's handkerchief to wipe away his flowing tears. Michael's speech fades into the background as Richard remembers the story of how his mother actually died. Terry tells the story by creating a story circle for the man who felt cheated by Richard's father. He leaves his comfort zone to set things right with George Cypher by force. The man adapts to the situation, using physical violence to punish George for cheating him. The man gets what he's searching for when he succeeds with his might-makes-right approach to this situation. In the commotion, a lantern falls and catches the house on fire. The man pays a heavy price when he realizes his actions have caused a far greater injustice than the one he was seeking recompense for. The man returns to his comfort zone away from the Cypher household, having been changed by the guilt he now carries. It also shows the origin of Richard's aversion to anger, as well as the powerful grip that such beliefs instill into a person's mind. Richard's father said it was anger that has killed his mother, and rather than analyze the nuance of the situation, Richard is too blinded by the potential for tragedy associated with a specific thing that he never goes on to analyze that it is not the thing in question that was responsible for the tragedy, but rather the poor choices and actions taken by the man who caused the event. It's a perfect allegory for Richard's struggle through the 5 stages of grief, as he is trapped in denial. He creates a mental paradox that he cannot escape because he has given anger an elevated status that renders men powerless against it. Richard's rational mind knows that the man's actions were responsible for his mother's death. Richard's hold to his childhood belief that anger was responsible removes personal accountability and replaces it with a mysterious, powerful force that supersedes the free will of the man. This paradox leaves Richard with no solution. Another good example of a fixed point in Richard's character development. In Chainfire, the 9th book of the series, Richard is taught the wizard's 9th rule, and eventually comes to realize that contradictions cannot exist. To believe in them, you must abandon the most important thing you possess, your rational mind. He goes on to say the wager for such a bargain is your life, and in such an exchange, you always lose what you have at stake. Goodkind immediately reinforces this dynamic when Michael comes down and instantly brushes off Richard's claims of impropriety, and twice in a row, Richard stops himself pursuing the appropriate and rational response of anger towards the memory of his mother being used by Michael for political gain. When Richard questions Michael about the boundary and his claims of its uncertain future, Michael does not reveal the source of his information, but he cannot miss the chance to portray himself as the hero of his own story. He claims that what he is doing will give the people of Westland a better and more prominent life. From Michael's perspective, prominence does equal a better life. Michael is later revealed to have put his faith in Dark and Rahl to offer Westland his protection and a place of status if he would join with them. Given Michael's lifestyle, his priorities are shown to lean towards valuing status above all else. And if he has enough status, he can do better for the people of Westland than they could ever do for themselves without his help. Michael reveals that the trackers didn't find anything and scolds his brother for ignoring the clues that says his father looks to have been killed by an angry client. If you look at this from Richard's perspective and not the perspective of the reader, you can see that this mental attack is particularly sharp because it was specifically crafted to closely resemble the circumstances surrounding his mother's death. Michael blames the anger of the man and attacks the most vulnerable part of Richard's mental armor. The referent instinctively reminds Richard of the anger that killed his mother. His father made someone angry and it killed him. And if Richard is angry at Michael, then he will be guilty of repeating a mistake that he knows will bring nothing but tragedy. Michael does exactly the same thing he did to the crowd moments ago to his brother Richard, and is only able to accomplish that by exploiting the one part of his mind that he knows Richard does not see rationally. And it works. Richard lets the matter go and moves on, unable to process the 5 stages of grief and unable to reach the final stage of acceptance. Richard's mind makes a mental note of how it doesn't make sense that he was unable to find any tracks. Kalen introduces himself and apologizes for their rough appearance. Michael invites Richard to the stay of the night. Richard tells Michael he's going to see Zed. Michael invites Kalen to spend the night with him, which she declines. Michael puts his hands on her inappropriately and insists that she reconsider. And Michael mentions being able to fall in love with her, which Kalen then makes a reference to the method her power uses to consume a person's mind when she uses it on them. Kalen uses her finger to cut Michael's skin, and the pain forces him to remove his hands from her. Kalen leaves. The author then mentions how Richard cannot suppress an angry glare towards his brother and leaves as well. By allowing himself to feel anger in the last sentence of the chapter, we see the completion of a mini character arc for Richard. We're shown how in the past, and even in the present, he was incapable of growing past his beliefs about anger. But at the end of this chapter, when confronted with something so undeniably reprehensible, he cannot deny the truth that anger is an appropriate response to that situation. With that sentence, we're shown Richard's growth as a character, and on a subconscious level, that releases much of the pent-up tension that was building from Richard's inability to complete that story circle. He was finally able to return to a place of comfort, having changed when he experiences anger, expresses it, and then leaves his brother's fancy home to enter the woods. It's time for the official #1 quote from Seeking the Truth About the Sword of Truth in Wizard's First Rule, Chapter 3. Please note that the views and opinions of what the official #1 quote from this chapter is may differ from the views and opinions expressed by you about what your #1 favorite quote from this chapter is. In the event that your #1 quote is different from the #1 quote mentioned here, please list your candidate for #1 quote in the comments below. And the official #1 quote is, Chase nodded once to reassure her. The matter settled, Richard Word being all the reassurance he needed. In the next chapter, the identity of the primary antagonist is revealed, and we experience Richard and Kalen's first encounter with him. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you feel like you've gotten something of value from this video, please like and subscribe to the channel. And if you really like it, I ask that you share a link with this video to those who you think might enjoy it as well. If those feelings are not there yet, I invite you to come back for the next episode and give me a chance to try and change your mind. Thank you for watching. My name is Tom, and I've been your guide. This has been Seeking the Truth About the Sword of Truth. Come and join me next time, so while I'm seeking these truths, you can become seekers of that truth as well. Thank you, and I hope to see you again.